On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida. 73 seconds later, it broke apart in the sky, killing all 7 crew members. The cause wasn't an engine failure. It wasn't a software glitch. It wasn't a meteor. It was a rubber ring. A rubber ring that got too cold. And the worst part is that people knew. They had been warning about it for years. And on the night before the launch, engineers begged NASA not to fly. NASA launched anyway.
The Space Shuttle was launched by 2 solid rocket boosters, built by a company called Morton Thiokol. Each booster was too large to transport in one piece, so it was built in segments. These segments were joined together at what were called field joints. To seal those joints, engineers used 2 rubber O-rings, circular bands about a 1/4 inch thick. The design was supposed to work like this. When the rocket ignited, pressure from inside the booster would push the rubber into its groove, creating a tight seal. The problem was that the joint flexed during launch. The metal parts moved, and the O-rings had to respond fast enough to maintain the seal before hot gas could escape. In warm conditions, the rubber was flexible. It moved quickly. It sealed. In cold conditions, the rubber stiffened. It moved slowly. And for a few critical seconds, the joint was open.
Roger Boisjoly was a mechanical engineer at Morton Thiokol. In July 1985, 6 months before the disaster, he wrote a memo to his superiors. He said that the O-ring design was flawed. He said that if the problem was not fixed, it would result in a catastrophe of the highest order. He had investigated a booster from a January 1985 flight and found that the primary O-ring had failed completely. The secondary O-ring had barely held. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "The result would be a loss of a flight and its crew." His warning was filed. Nothing changed. On the evening of January 27, 1986, the night before the launch, Boisjoly and his colleagues learned that temperatures at the launch pad were predicted to drop to below freezing, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. They panicked. They called a teleconference with NASA managers and recommended that the launch be delayed. Their data showed that the O-rings had never been tested below 53 degrees. The forecast was 29 degrees colder than any previous launch.
NASA managers were not happy. Lawrence Mulloy, the solid rocket booster project manager at Marshall Space Flight Center, pushed back. He and other managers challenged the engineers' data, questioned their conclusions, and applied pressure. The teleconference lasted hours. Eventually, Morton Thiokol's management overrode its own engineers. Robert Lund, the vice president of engineering, was told to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. The recommendation to delay was reversed. The launch was approved. At 11:38 a.m. on January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off. The temperature was 36 degrees. The overnight low had been 28. Ice covered the launch pad. The O-rings were stiffer than they had ever been during a launch. But for the first 58 seconds, everything appeared normal. The boosters fired, the shuttle climbed, and then, at 58 seconds, the shuttle hit high-altitude wind shear.
The wind shear jolted the booster. The joint shifted. The ash that had formed from the burned O-ring, which had been acting as a weak temporary seal, crumbled. Hot gas, pressurized and burning at thousands of degrees, shot out of the joint in a blowtorch-like plume. It burned through the strut that connected the booster to the external fuel tank. It burned into the tank itself. At about 73 seconds, the rear dome of the external tank failed. Liquid hydrogen dumped into the air. The right booster swung into the tank and the shuttle's wing. The vehicle broke apart. 7 crew members, Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe, who was supposed to be the first teacher in space, all gone in an instant, 46,000 feet above the Atlantic.
But here's the part that makes this tragedy unbearable. The flaw was known, not suspected, known. Since 1977, test data had shown that the O-ring design was potentially catastrophic. NASA had been warned 9 years before the disaster. And in the months leading up to January 1986, the warning signs had been escalating. O-ring erosion occurred on nearly every shuttle flight in 1985. On one flight, STS-51B, both the primary and secondary O-rings were damaged. The system was failing, flight after flight, and each time it held by a margin that got thinner and thinner. The Rogers Commission, the presidential panel that investigated the disaster, found that NASA managers had known about the flaw and had not addressed it. They had accepted a known risk. They had normalized a deviation. Each flight that didn't end in disaster made them more confident that the next one wouldn't either. The engineers kept filing reports. The managers kept waiving the launch constraints, until the morning when the rubber finally broke.
The investigation that followed was led by a commission chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers. But the moment people remember didn't come from a bureaucrat. It came from a physicist, Richard Feynman. During a televised hearing, Feynman took a piece of rubber O-ring material, submerged it in a glass of ice water, and pulled it out. The rubber didn't spring back. It stayed compressed. Cold made it stiff. That was the whole story. A Nobel laureate with a glass of ice water had demonstrated what a team of engineers had been trying to tell NASA for years. The O-rings didn't work in the cold. They never had. The design was, in the commission's words, unacceptably sensitive to temperature. The ice water was all it took to prove.
The Rogers Commission didn't just blame the rubber. They blamed the system. They found that NASA's organizational culture had normalized deviance. Problems were accepted as normal. Warnings were treated as bureaucratic obstacles. Engineers were overruled by managers who were under pressure to maintain the launch schedule. The commission called it a silent safety program. Safety staff weren't even mentioned during hours of testimony. The decision-makers on the night before the launch didn't know the full history of the O-ring problem. They didn't know that the engineers had formally recommended against launching. The information existed, it just never reached the people who needed it. The Challenger disaster wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a human failure. A failure of listening, of trusting process over expertise, of treating a known risk as an acceptable one, until it wasn't. Roger Boisjoly, the engineer who tried to stop the launch, spent the rest of his life telling this story. He said that the evening of January 27th was the worst night of his life. He tried to warn them. They launched anyway. I'm Hidden Mechanics. If this made you think, subscribe. There are more invisible forces shaping your world, and most of them you'll never see coming.